Mussel Island, which no longer exists, used to be located in Newtown Creek, where the creek meets Maspeth Creek, and it is the place where gelatin was invented. For many years, the island earned its name before Europeans even named it by harboring mussels, clams, and all other watery creatures that many people enjoy eating. A 1771 advertisement for a farm on the Queen's side even brags that the buyer may be supplied with fish, oysters, clams, fowls, and fresh meat of all kinds in a few hours' notice. There even exists a story about the island wherein a man who had tended to his mussel and clam farms in the creek had those mussels and clams stolen. Thursday, April 7, 1825, the Long Island Star. Law case. A case lately came before Judge Betts at the Circuit Court in New York, brought by John G. Vancott against Oliver Perry. The plaintiff owns a farm bounded on Newtown Creek, and like his neighbors has been in the habit of planting clams and oysters in the creek opposite his farm. The plaintiff, it seems, had taken the oysters bought and planted by Vancott, who now prosecuted for the trespass. The defendant moved a non-suit on the ground that plaintiff had not shown a definite possession nor sufficient facts to warrant a prescription. This was allowed by the court, and a non-suit granted accordingly. This abundance was not even unique to Mussel Island. Our 1882 Queen's History tells us that nearby North Hempstead had long been famed for the excellence of their clams, but of late years their oysters, too, have come into prominence. The first oysters were planted here by Henry Cock in 1832 in his mill pond, the seed being procured from the shores of the bay. They also cite other farms planted with seeds obtained from the natural beds in the Sound and the beds in the Hudson River. And the Brooklyn Daily Eagle reported in 1884 that the oyster industry of Long Island undoubtedly gives employment to more men and returns a much larger income than any other native industry on the island. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle explained in 1884 the problems of oyster farming. The great drawback to East River oyster planting of every kind is the abundance of enemies with which the beds are infested. These consist of drumfish, skates, and to a small degree of various other fish, of certain sponges and invertebrates that do slight damage, and of various boring mollusks, the crushing winkle, and the insidious starfish or sea star. It is the last named plague that the planter dreads the most, and the directly traceable harm it does amounts to many tens of thousands of dollars annually in this district alone. By 1875, the industries on the creek wanted to use Mussel Island for themselves, and it was partially dredged for Peter Cooper's glue works, the Peter Cooper who founded Cooper Union, where gelatin was manufactured from the leftover animal parts that people did not eat. Sunday, August 15, 1875, the New York Times. At a meeting of the Queens County Board of Supervisors held yesterday, it was announced that a compromise had been made between those favoring and those opposing the establishment of Peter Cooper's glue factory upon Mussel Island in Newtown Creek, upon terms acceptable to both sides. It is agreed that a channel, not now navigable, shall be dredged out on the north side of the island to carry off the refuse of the factory, which would otherwise be objectionable in a sanitary point of view. The board then passed a resolution permitting Mr. Cooper to construct a drawbridge from the mainland in Kings County to Mussel Island in Queens County, and to erect his glue factory on the island. A very long Brooklyn Daily Eagle article about the Newtown Creek nuisances, mostly defending all the polluters along the creek, ends describing the majesty of the creek's oysters before industry came to town. Newtown Creek is unquestionably in better condition than it was 5, 3, 2 years, or 1 year ago, but there is room for improvement. Old residents look back longingly to the time when its limpid waters, set in soft green meadows, this little stream was the choicest fishing ground in Kings County. Then a rare old fisherman named Primrose kept a boathouse where now is Maspeth Avenue. The choicest oyster beds and clam diggings were about Primrose's place, and every day he served up a clam chowder of such fragrance and flavor as the graybeards declared are unknown in these modern times. The fame of Primrose's chowders spread, and his boats and fishing grounds grew in popularity and yielded famous strings of sea bass and nets of eels that made the fishermen stagger. Then one evil day the oil works men built at the mouth of the creek. Primrose knew nothing about oil works and went on fishing, cooking chowders and broiling oysters in calm unconcern. But one morning Primrose ran his oyster rake down in his favorite bed and drew up, instead of oysters, a lump of foul black mud. Primrose stared at it in consternation. Then he dropped the rake, sadly saying, "Goodbye, oysters," and pulled back to the boathouse. The little boathouse faded and shrunk from that day. Men still tried to fish in Newtown Creek, but the fish they caught had the flavor of petroleum and could not be eaten. Presently, fish began to die and float out on the tainted tide. Eels will thrive and grow fat on the sewage of most cities, but Newtown Creek is too much for them. Last summer, an eel pond near the banks broke away and ran into the creek. A few hours later, the eels were seen limp and dead, floating off toward the sea. Sometimes these clam peddlers were lifesavers. Friday, March 27, 1857, the Brooklyn Evening Star. Yesterday afternoon, 2 clam peddlers, while on their way from Newtown to Williamsburg and crossing the Newtown Creek, discovered a man in the mire and water up to his shoulders. They rescued and brought him to the 17th Ward station house in an exhausted condition. He proved to be a mendicant, and upon his person was found a paper representing his name as J. Rossi, a native of Sardinia, who had been ruined by an inundation on the River Po on the 10th of November, 1856. Rossi was properly attended to and will probably live to solicit alms from the benevolent for some time to come. As late as 1929, a writer was promoting the creek as a fine place to escape the city for some nature sightseeing. February 3, 1929, The New York Times, by Francis D. McMullen. Up Turbid and Congested Newtown Creek. Pleasure excursions on this urbanized little estuary disclose the fact that despite its business, it develops romantic lore. People do not travel for pleasure on Newtown Creek. Tourists who steam by the tens of thousands up past the Palisades of the Hudson, or across the harbor to the Statue of Liberty, or out through the Narrows to Atlantic Highlands, mostly have never even heard of this little blind waterway branching off from the East River, opposite 23rd Street, Manhattan, piercing Long Island between Long Island City and Brooklyn. No pleasure craft go that way, unless an occasional commuting motorboat of some captain of industry be so classed. Nevertheless, the turbid Newtown Creek is well worth a sightseeing trip. Elements of romance, folklore, and adventure await him in particular, who travels it with Captain Stillwagon on the sturdy towboat Russell 16. Creek is a word redolent with idyllic scenes, the old swimming hole, the old fishing pole, the little skiff bobbing in the shade of the trees. But the Newtown Creek of the present belongs to a citified, less fragrant branch of the family. It is so different from rural creeks that some people in recent years vainly tried to have it renamed Nassau River. For Newtown Creek it has been, ever since early Dutch maidens watered their cattle there, and Newtown Creek, those who have made most to do with it insist it shall remain. Newtown Creek is said to be the busiest little body of water for its size in the world. Contradiction will hardly be forthcoming from those who, trying to cross it, have had to wait in long lines of vehicles at the drawbridge while a tiny tug maneuvered its unwieldy train of barges through, to be followed at a hair-breadth by another moving a long sailing vessel, and another with a huge mechanism like a steam shovel in tow. This regatta of industry sometimes keeps a bridge open an hour, for the law of the nation gives precedence to navigation. If those who have not seen Newtown Creek at its busiest are skeptical of its importance, they have only to consult the latest report of the Chief of Army Engineers to find that it carries in a year 1/3 as much tonnage as the entire Mississippi River from Cairo, Illinois to New Orleans. Captain Stillwagon's yarns of this busy little waterway, spun as he goes about the task of showing its activities to the visitor, do not reach back to the days when Newtown Creek was a bucolic stream. But his forebears knew it when it was a good deal different from what it is now. His father and his grandfather before him piloted there. He himself grew up half on the bank and half on the water. Now, over there's, where the French government had a supply station during the World War, he indicated the point of land at the mouth of the creek as the Russell 16 turned at his touch. See this big factory here? That's where all your rugs are made and your mats. Over yonder there was a fire last week. A schooner alongside got pretty badly scorched. Might have been worse if one of our boats hadn't been coming along about that time and towed her off. Here comes the first bridge, and that's where they're building the subway. I'll take a run up Whale Creek here and show you that burned schooner. The old whaling vessels used to put in here. That's how it got its name, but don't much of anything put in here now. On the point they're used to build racing yachts, and before that it was Pottery Beach, with boathouses and bathing facilities, quite a pleasure resort. See these two masts sticking out of the water. Well, that's all that's left of a barge on which many and many an immigrant got into this land. It used to bring them over from Ellis Island to the Battery, until it became out of date. Then they towed it up here, where they thought it would be out of the way. There she is now, that schooner that was in the fire. She'll have to have new masts in the spring. In here at the end of Whale Creek is where the Merrimac, later a Confederate ironclad, was built. Here's a city dump pier where they load those scows that go out to sea. People have been complaining a lot about it, and so now they're getting ready to build an incinerator a little further on. All those tanks there is where you get your gasoline for your automobile. Across the way is where your candles come from and your soap and salad dressings. Those smokestacks are from Chemical and Copper Works. You always find the two together. The Copper Works, you see, put stuff into the air that the Chemical Works take out. Over there where the white smoke is, they're making coke. And those piles of coal, they're low now, but sometimes they're like mountains. That's where you get your city steam. The Russell 16 slowed down as the Greenpoint Bridge swung around and did honor to the diminutive tugboat Dart, as busily engaged with her tow as an ant with a lump of sugar. I bet a seaman would laugh at that little boat, Captain Stillwagon reflected, but I'd be willing to bet $500 he couldn't handle her unless he'd had experience on the creek. Towing here isn't like towing anywhere else. You never saw anything like the congestion. That's Mussel Island over there, that black mud. The mussels went away long ago, and the island's most gone now, too. I expect they'll cut it all away before long. On the other side of it is what we used to call Tin Can Point. There was a fellow who used to collect all the tin cans he could find and bring them there to melt them down for solder. He had a daughter we used to call Tin Can Mary, and that'd make her so mad she'd throw things at us as we passed. Oh well, that old man made his fortune and moved on, and then came along somebody else and made the first egg powders there. In English Kills, traffic became so thick that the water ahead was all covered up, and so the Russell 16 backed and shivered and retraced her course, Captain Stillwagon pointing out objects of interest he had overlooked coming up. The weather-beaten hulk, North American, once a seeker in faraway seas on North Pole exploration, now painted a dull red and serving as a gasoline filling station, and the Underwriter, with a great hole in her side, brought up here and put out of commission because the Coast Guard caught her in the act of carrying rum. In 1921, the Merchants Association of New York reported on the Newtown Creek Industrial District of New York, noting that the present owners of Mussel Island have tentatively agreed to cede to the city of New York their right and title in Mussel Island in return for land underwater in the present bed of Newtown Creek, now owned by the city. They don't tell us who owned the island, however, and it is difficult to find information on who, if anyone, inhabited the island. But in 1930, the U.S. Army Engineers Report reveals that it is the Brooklyn Union Gas Company. A National Grid report from 2012 reveals that by 1925, Mussel Island and the channel between the island and the mainland were filled and made a part of the site when a bulkhead system was constructed. In 1926, the island shows up in a few stories. Wednesday, August 11, 1926, the New York Herald Tribune. Roger Kahn's speedboat found on Mussel Island. Craft stolen from Cold Spring Harbor deserted on Newtown Creek mudflat. With her engine out of commission, but otherwise undamaged, the 200-horsepower speedboat Rowika, owned by Roger Wolfe Kahn, jazz orchestra leader and son of Otto H. Kahn, was found yesterday on a mudflat on Mussel Island in Newtown Creek. The Rowika was stolen early Monday from its anchorage at a yacht club in Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island. It had recently been delivered by the manufacturers and was capable of high speed. Residents near Mussel Island said the Rowika had been brought there Monday afternoon by a man who said he was going to Albany to get repair parts for the engine. He failed to return. Several other cases of boat thefts have been reported recently. Wednesday, August 11, 1926, the El Paso Herald. Millionaire's son loses badge, calls police to get boat. New York, Roger Wolfe Kahn, son of Otto Kahn, the banker, held an appointment as a special detective during the Highland administration. But Police Commissioner McLaughlin recently announced that the appointment didn't mean anything anymore. Accordingly, when nasty, mean thieves stole Roger's speedboat Sunday, young Kahn didn't don his false whiskers and badge and set out in pursuit. He sent in a call for the police. He explained that he only detected society crime cases anyhow. Tuesday, 2 real detectives got his boat back for him, finding the $15,000 craft on a mudflat off Mussel Island. Local oysters were so prevalent in 1800s New York City that the Times-Union printed a comedic parody of restaurant menus that reads like the Monty Python Spam sketch. Friday, August 5, 1859, the Times-Union, a rich bill of fare. The following is the bill of fare at the surf house Fire Island, which, a contemporary suggests, reminds one of Domestic's famous beer program. Our food consists of fish and clams, oysters, lobsters, fish chowder, clam chowder, oysters fried, roasted, boiled, and stewed, and raw, roasted clams, stewed clams, fish and oysters, oysters and fish, fish and clams and fish, oysters and clams and oysters and fish, lobsters and clams and lobsters, oysters and lobsters and lobsters and oysters, lobsters and fish and lobsters and fish.